Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Today I am here to tell you that the West is in danger. It is in danger because those who are supposed to defend the values of the West are co-opted by a worldview that inevitably leads to socialism and consequently to poverty. Unfortunately, in recent decades, motivated by some well-meaning desires to help others, and others by the desire to belong to a privileged caste, the main leaders of the West have abandoned the model of freedom for various versions of what we call collectivism. We are here to tell you that collectivist experiments are never the solution to the problems that afflict the citizens of the world. On the contrary, they are the cause. Believe me, no one is better than us Argentinians to provide testimonies on these two issues. When we adopted the model of freedom back in 1860, in 35 years we became the world's leading power. While when we embraced collectivism over the last 100 years, we saw how our citizens began to systematically impoverish until falling to the 140th position in the world. But before we can have this discussion, it would be important for us to first look at the data that supports why free enterprise capitalism is not only a possible system to end world poverty, but also the only morally desirable system to achieve it. If we consider the history of economic progress, we can see how from year zero until around 1800, the world's GDP per capita remained practically constant throughout the reference period. If one looks at the graph of the evolution of economic growth throughout the history of humanity, one would be looking at a graph shaped like a hockey stick. An exponential function that remained constant for 90% of the time, and then skyrocketed exponentially starting in the 19th century. The only exception to this story of stagnation occurred at the end of the 15th century, with the discovery of America. But aside from this exception, throughout the entire period from year zero to 1800, global GDP per capita remained stagnant. Now, not only did capitalism generate an explosion of wealth from the moment it was adopted as an economic system, but if one analyzes the data, what is observed is that growth has been accelerating throughout the entire period. Throughout the entire period from year zero to 1800, the growth rate of GDP per capita remained stable at around 0.02% per year, meaning virtually no growth. Starting from the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, the growth rate rises to 0.60. At that rate, it would take 107 years to double the GDP per capita. Now, if we observe the period between 1900 and 1950, the growth rate accelerates to 1.36% per year. We no longer need 107 years to double the GDP per capita, but rather 66. And if we take the period between 1950 and the year 2000, we see that the growth rate was 2.1% per year, which would mean that in just 33 years, we could double the world's GDP per capita. This trend, far from stopping, remains alive even today. If we take the period between the year 2000 and 2023, the growth rate has accelerated again to 3% per year, which implies that we could double our GDP per capita in the world in just 23 years. Now, when studying GDP per capita from the year 1800 to the present day, what is observed is that after the Industrial Revolution, global GDP per capita multiplied by more than 15 times, generating an explosion of wealth that lifted 90% of the world's population out of poverty. We must never forget that by the year 1800, nearly 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, while that number fell to 5% by the year 2020, prior to the pandemic. The conclusion is obvious. Far from being the cause of our problems, free enterprise capitalism as an economic system is the only tool we have to end hunger, poverty, and destitution across the entire planet. The empirical evidence is undeniable. Therefore, since there is no doubt that free enterprise capitalism is superior in productive terms, the leftist doxa has attacked capitalism for its moral issues, claiming, according to its detractors, that it is unjust. They say that free enterprise capitalism is bad because it is individualistic, and that collectivism is good because it is altruistic towards others, and consequently, they advocate for social justice. But this concept, which has become fashionable in the first world recently, has been a constant in the political discourse of my country for over 80 years. And the problem is that social justice is not just, nor does it contribute to overall well-being. On the contrary, it is an intrinsically unjust idea because it is violent. It is unjust because the state is financed through taxes, and taxes are collected coercively. Can any of us say that we pay taxes voluntarily? This means that the state is financed through coercion, and that the greater the tax burden, the greater the coercion, and the lesser the freedom. Those who promote social justice start from the idea that the entire economy is a pie that can be distributed in a different way. But that cake is not fixed. It is wealth that is generated in what, for example, Israel Kirchner calls a market discovery process. If the good or service offered by a company is not desired, that company goes bankrupt, unless it adapts to what the market is demanding. If you produce a good quality product at an attractive price, you will do well and produce more. Thus, the market is a discovery process in which the capitalist finds the right course along the way. But if the state punishes the capitalist for being successful and blocks him in this discovery process, it destroys his incentives, and the consequence is that he will produce less, resulting in a smaller pie, which harms the entire society. Collectivism, by inhibiting these discovery processes and making it difficult to appropriate what has been discovered, ties the entrepreneur's hands and prevents them from producing better goods and offering better services at a better price. How can it be, then, that from academia, international organizations, politics, and economic theory, an economic system is demonized that has not only lifted the most extreme poverty from 90% of the world's population and continues to do so at an increasing pace, but is also just and morally superior? Thanks to free enterprise capitalism, the world is currently in its best moment. There has never been a time in all of human history of greater prosperity than the one we live in today. The world today is freer, richer, more peaceful, and more prosperous than at any other time in our history. This is true for everyone, but particularly for those countries that are free, where they respect economic freedom and the property rights of individuals. Because those countries that are free are 12 times richer than the repressed, the lowest decile. The distribution of free countries lives better than 90% of the population in repressed countries, having 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format and 50 times fewer in the extreme format. And as if that weren't enough, citizens of free countries live 25% longer than citizens of repressed countries. Now, to understand what we are here to defend, it is important to define what we mean when we talk about libertarianism. To define it, I refer to the words of the greatest proponent of the ideas of freedom in Argentina, Professor Alberto Venegas Lynch Jr., who states that libertarianism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others, based on the principle of non-aggression, and in defense of the right to life, liberty, and property, whose fundamental institutions are private property, free markets, free from state intervention, free competition, the division of labor, and social cooperation, where one can only be successful by serving others with better quality goods at a better price. In other words, the capitalist, the successful entrepreneur, is a social benefactor who, far from appropriating the wealth of others, contributes to the general well-being. Ultimately, a successful entrepreneur is a hero. This is the model that we are proposing for Argentina's future. A model based on the fundamental principles of the defense of life, liberty, and property. Now, if free enterprise capitalism and economic freedom have been extraordinary tools to end poverty in the world, and we find ourselves today in the best moment in the history of humanity, it is worth it. Why then do I say that the West is in danger? I say that the West is in danger precisely because in those countries where we should defend the values of the free market, private property, and other institutions of libertarianism, sectors of the political and economic establishment, some due to errors in their theoretical framework and others due to ambition for power, are undermining the foundations of libertarianism, opening the doors to socialism and potentially condemning us to poverty, misery, and stagnation. Because it must never be forgotten that socialism is always and everywhere an impoverishing phenomenon that has failed in every country where it has been attempted. It was a failure in the economic realm, it was a failure in the social realm, it was a failure in the cultural realm, and it also killed more than 100 million human beings. The essential problem of the West today is that we must not only confront those who, even after the fall of the wall and the overwhelming empirical evidence, continue to advocate for impoverishing socialism, but also our own leaders, thinkers, and academics who, sheltered in a flawed theoretical framework, undermine the foundations of the system that has provided us with the greatest expansion of wealth and prosperity in our history. The theoretical framework I am referring to is that of neoclassical economic theory, which designs a toolset that inadvertently ends up being functional. The interference of the state, socialism, and the degradation of society is the problem for the neoclassicals. Since the model they fell in love with does not map against reality, they attribute the error to the supposed failure of the market. Instead of revising the premises of their model, based on an alleged market failure, regulations are introduced that only generate distortions in the price system, which hinder economic calculation and consequently savings, investment, and growth. This problem essentially lies in the fact that even the supposedly libertarian economists do not understand what the market is. Since if 2009 were understood, it would quickly become clear that it is impossible for something like a market failure to exist. The market is not merely a graphical description of a supply curve and a demand curve. In a graph, the market is a mechanism of social cooperation, where property rights are voluntarily exchanged. Therefore, given this definition, talking about market failure is an oxymoron. There is no market failure if transactions are voluntary. The only context in which there can be a market failure is if there is coercion. And the only one with the capacity to coerce in a generalized manner is the state, which has the monopoly on violence. Consequently, if someone believes there is a market failure, I would recommend that they check if there is state intervention in the middle, and if they find that there is no state intervention in the middle, I suggest they analyze it again, because it is definitely wrong. Market failures do not exist. An example of the supposed market failures described by neoclassical economic theory is the concentrated structures of the economy. However, without functions that exhibit increasing returns to scale, which correspond to the concentrated structures of the economy, we could not explain economic growth from 1800 to today. Notice how interesting this is. Since the year 1800 onwards, with the population multiplying more than 8 or 9 times, the per capita product grew more than 15 times. That is to say, there are increasing returns. This reduced extreme poverty from 95% to 5%. However, the presence of increasing returns implies concentrated structures, which would be called, for example, a monopoly. How can it be that something that has generated so much well-being, for neoclassical economic theory, that is a market failure? Neoclassical economists think outside the box. When the model fails, do not get angry with reality. Get angry with the model and change it. The dilemma faced by the neoclassical model is that they claim to want to perfect the functioning of the market by addressing what they consider failures, but in doing so, they not only open the doors to socialism, but also undermine economic growth. Regular monopolies, destroying their profits, and wrecking the increasing returns would automatically destroy economic growth. In other words, every time you want to correct a supposed market failure, you are inevitably, either by misunderstanding what the market is or by falling in love with a failed model, opening the doors to socialism and condemning people to poverty. However, in the face of the theoretical demonstration that state intervention is harmful, the empirical evidence of its failure, because it could be no other way, is that the solution proposed by the collectivists is not greater freedom, but rather greater regulation, generating a downward spiral of regulations until we are all poorer and our lives depend on a bureaucrat sitting in a luxury office. Given the resounding failure of collectivist models and the undeniable advances of the free world, socialists were forced to change their agenda. They left behind the class struggle based on the economic system to replace it with other supposed social conflicts that are equally harmful to community life and economic growth. The first of these new battles was the ridiculous and unnatural fight between man and woman. Libertarianism already establishes equality between the sexes. The foundational stone of our creed states that all men are created equal, that we all have the same inalienable rights granted by the Creator, among which are life, liberty, and property. The only outcome of this radical feminism agenda has been greater state intervention to hinder the economic process, creating jobs for bureaucrats who have contributed nothing to society, whether in the form of women's ministries or international organizations dedicated to promoting this agenda. Another conflict that socialists raise is that of man against nature. They argue that human beings harm the planet and that it must be protected at all costs, even going so far as to advocate for population control mechanisms or the bloody agenda of abortion. Unfortunately, these harmful ideas have strongly permeated our society. The neo-Marxists have managed to co-opt the common sense of the West. They achieved this through the appropriation of the media, culture, universities, and yes, also international organizations. This last case is the most serious, perhaps 2009, because it involves institutions that have enormous influence on the political and economic decisions of the countries that are part of these multilateral organizations. Fortunately, more and more of us are daring to raise our voices, because we see that if we do not confront these ideas head-on, the only possible outcome is that we will increasingly have more state, more regulation, more socialism, more poverty, less freedom, and consequently, a worse standard of living. Unfortunately, the West has already begun to walk down this path. I know that it may sound ridiculous to many to suggest that the West has turned to socialism, but it is only ridiculous to the extent that one restricts oneself to the traditional economic definition of socialism, which states that it is an economic system where the state owns the means of production. This definition should be, from my point of view, updated to the present circumstances. Today's states do not need to directly control the means of production to control every aspect of individuals' lives. With tools such as monetary issuance, debt, subsidies, interest rate control, price controls, and regulations to correct supposed market failures, they can control the destinies of millions of human beings. This is how we arrive at the point where, under different names or forms, large parts of the politically accepted offerings in most Western countries are collectivist variants. Whether they openly declare themselves as communists, fascists, Nazis, socialists, social democrats, or national socialists, Christian Democrats, Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, progressives, populists, nationalists, or globalists. In essence, there are no substantive differences. They all maintain that the state should direct all aspects of individuals' lives. All of them define a model contrary to the one that led humanity to the most spectacular progress in its history. We come here today to invite other Western countries to return to the path of prosperity. Economic freedom, limited government, and unrestricted respect for private property are essential elements for economic growth. This phenomenon of impoverishment caused by collectivism is neither a fantasy nor fatalism. It is a reality that Argentinians have known very well for about 100 years. Because we have already lived it. We have already gone through this. Because, as I said before, since we decided to abandon the model of freedom that had made us rich, we are trapped in a downward spiral where we become poorer every day. That is, we have already experienced it ourselves, and we are here to warn you about what can happen if the Western countries that became rich through the model of freedom continue down this path of servitude. The Argentine case is the empirical demonstration that it does not matter how rich you are, how many natural resources you have, how skilled the population is, how educated it may be, or how many gold bars are in the central bank's coffers. If measures are adopted that hinder the free functioning of markets, free competition, free pricing systems, if trade is obstructed, and if private property is attacked, the only possible outcome is poverty. Therefore, to conclude, I want to give a message to all the entrepreneurs present here, and to those who are not, but are following us from all over the planet. Do not let yourselves be intimidated by the political elite or by the parasites who live off the state. Do not surrender to a political class that only wants to perpetuate itself in power and maintain its privileges. You are social benefactors. You are heroes. You are the creators of the most extraordinary period of prosperity that we have ever lived. Let no one tell you that your ambition is immoral. If you make money, it is because you offer a better product at a better price, thereby contributing to the general welfare. Do not yield to the advance of the state. The state is not the solution. The state is the problem itself. You are the true protagonists of this story. And know that from today, you have Argentina as an unconditional ally. Thank you very much, and long live freedom.